He had it all: power, wealth, fear bending to his will. Luca Moretti, mafia boss, master of control, never feared anything, except the vulnerability he could no longer ignore. A single photo showed twins he didn't know existed, children from a past he had abandoned. Pride had protected him for years. Now it threatened to destroy everything he loved. I'm Selena, and this is Dark Love Stories. Tonight you'll witness a life of power collide with secrets, love, and devastating consequences. Listen closely. Some choices can never be undone. He had no idea what he had lost. From the high glass tower of his empire, Luca Moretti surveyed the city like a king surveying a conquered realm, the night lights flickering beneath him like loyal subjects. Every detail of his life had been carved, polished, and arranged with surgical precision. The tailored suits, the black Italian leather shoes that whispered authority with every step, the penthouse that overlooked the river, shimmering under the moon's pale approval. To the world, he was untouchable, invincible, a mafia boss whose name alone drew respect, fear, and admiration. Power radiated from him like a dark halo, and yet, in the quiet hours before dawn, Luca felt the weight of something unnameable pressing against his chest, a hollowness he refused to acknowledge. Tonight, the penthouse was alive with celebration. The engagement party had been a flawless exhibition of wealth and control, glittering chandeliers casting diamonds of light across polished marble, crystal glasses clinking in rehearsed harmony. Guests had whispered behind drawn smiles, praising his choice, the elegance of his bride-to-be, her luminous beauty paired with her soft, controlled manners, the perfect bride for the perfect man. Yet in every corner of that glittering room, Luca felt a tremor beneath his golden facade, a quiet pulse of wrongness that he could neither suppress nor define. He moved through the crowd like a predator gliding among prey, his black eyes scanning, calculating, commanding. Hands shook in his presence, compliments stuttered under his scrutiny, and yet, despite this careful orchestration, a single sensation tugged insistently at the edges of his mind: absence. Absence of someone who had once been the axis of his world. Someone whose laughter had once broken through his rigid control like sunlight through storm clouds. He shoved the thought down, as he always did, burying it under layers of pride and obligation. Meanwhile, across the city, Isabella sat alone in her dim apartment, the scent of rain still clinging to her hair and the faint hum of the radiator filling the empty spaces. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through old photos on her phone, lingering on images that made her chest ache. The way Luca's smile used to tilt, so rarely soft, so rarely vulnerable. The quiet moments when he let someone in, when his pride softened into something dangerously human. She told herself she was done, that she would not reopen the door she had slammed so many years ago. Yet tonight, compelled by some unnameable longing or guilt, she tapped on a photo she had meant to send to a friend, a photo that would unknowingly tear the fragile veneer from Luca's controlled existence. Twins, two small children, their innocent faces framed by curls and laughter, a life he had been blind to, a reality he had never chosen to acknowledge. In the penthouse, Luca moved toward the balcony, away from the hollow echoes of praise, and lit a cigarette. Smoke curled lazily around his fingers, twisting and dissolving like the illusions of permanence he clung to so desperately. He looked out over the city, imagining himself above it all, untouchable, while a single thought gnawed at him in the shadows. What if the life he meticulously built was built atop a lie, a truth he had refused to see? He flicked the ash mechanically, refusing to allow his mind to wander further. Pride demanded discipline, and Luca Moretti had always been disciplined. The party continued inside, a cacophony of music, laughter, and forced civility. He could hear the subtle shift of voices when his name passed lips, admiration and envy entwined in a dangerous dance. But it all felt distant, unreal. The real world, the one that pressed against him in quiet moments, was somewhere else, somewhere unreachable. He sensed a crack in his golden life, a fissure he refused to name, and the fear of that unknown seeped like a slow poison into his veins. Meanwhile, Isabella's finger hovered over the send button. Her heart drummed a chaotic rhythm against her ribs, a warning she ignored. For a fleeting moment she hesitated, the rational part of her mind screaming to stop, to protect both herself and him from the storm she knew would follow. But emotion, relentless and unyielding, won. The photo was sent, slipping through the ether like a pebble cast into a still pond. She did not see it, but somewhere across the city, in the penthouse where control was law, chaos had just been delivered in a simple digital envelope. Luca's phone buzzed on the marble counter. A trivial notification, he thought, perhaps another banal reminder from a contractor or a bored admirer. He picked it up with a casual flick, expecting nothing more than mundane distraction. The screen lit his sharp features, and then, as his eyes fell upon the image, the world shifted beneath him. His fingers tightened around the phone, knuckles whitening, as recognition surged through him with the force of a tidal wave. His chest constricted, a visceral pain unlike anything he had allowed himself to feel in years. There, on the screen, were two children, impossibly small and achingly familiar, children he had never met, children that should not exist outside the shadows of his carefully constructed life. His mind raced, a storm breaking through the barriers of pride and control. Memories he had buried began to claw their way to the surface. The fleeting touch of a hand that had once promised love, the soft laugh he had ignored, the warmth of a presence he had once cherished but abandoned. He could not breathe. His world, so precise and untouchable, began to crumble in real time, each second dragging him further into an abyss he had refused to consider. He turned sharply, almost violently, away from the balcony. The noise of the party, once irrelevant, now grated against him like fingernails on glass. Guests glanced toward him, puzzled by the sudden shift, the storm gathering behind his dark eyes. He had been a man of calculation, of cold, deliberate choices. But now, nothing was deliberate. Only instinct, raw and primal, drove him forward toward the one thing he had never expected to confront, a life he had denied, a truth he could not unsee. As he strode across the room, the flickering light of chandeliers casting shadows that seemed to dance with ominous intent, he barely noticed the whispers. They might have been compliments or fears. It no longer mattered. The photograph had undone years of control, and there was no turning back. Pride, that lifelong armor, could not shield him from the ache, the betrayal, the revelation. His wedding, the symbol of his dominance, of his golden life, suddenly seemed fragile, hollow, a mockery of the chaos he now faced. In her apartment, Isabella's phone sat idle on the table. She did not know, could not know, that she had triggered the beginning of a storm that would engulf them both. Outside, the rain began to fall in soft, relentless sheets, a mirror of the turmoil now racing through the streets below. In the penthouse, Luca pressed the phone to his chest, his breaths coming in shallow, jagged pulls. Pride, control, power, they had all been illusions, and now he was left with a choice he never expected to make. The first cracks in the golden facade of Luca Moretti's life had appeared, and nothing would ever be the same. The phone buzzed again. A second message, sent without warning, a lifeline or a dagger, he could not tell which. He stared at it, frozen, knowing that whatever lay behind that small screen had the potential to change everything. And then, a single thought, dark and insistent, whispered through his mind. He could not forgive. Not yet. Not ever, if the truth was what he feared it might be. He took a step back from the marble railing, and the sound of glass underfoot echoed like a crack in the sky. The golden life he had built teetered on the edge of collapse, and the photograph, The innocuous, impossible photograph hung between him and oblivion. And then he saw it, a name flashing on the screen, familiar, almost painfully so. Isabella. Luca's eyes widened in horror as he realized the truth before him. The woman he had loved and left was no longer just a memory. She had a life he had never imagined, and he had missed it all. He barely had time to react before another notification lit up the phone. Luca Moretti had always believed in control. In his penthouse, the city sprawled beneath him like a map to be navigated. Every street, every shadow, every whispered rumor cataloged in his mind with ruthless precision. Tonight, however, that control was a fragile thing, shattered by a single photograph. The twins, two children he had never known existed, stared back at him from his phone screen, their innocent eyes a mirror to his own blind pride. He paced the marble floors, cigarette smoke curling around him like restless ghosts. Every step was measured, deliberate, yet inside, a storm raged. He could feel it, the raw pulse of something he had refused to acknowledge for years. His mind tried to rationalize, to push the image into the shadows where it belonged, but every attempt failed. Pride, once his strongest ally, now felt like a shackle, chaining him to a choice he had never been prepared to face. Meanwhile, Isabella sat on the edge of her couch, the glow of her laptop screen illuminating her face. She had sent the photo without expectation, almost as a reflex, and now the seconds stretched like eternity. She tried to tell herself it was not her responsibility, that Luca had chosen his life, his pride, and his empire. But guilt clawed at her chest, sharp and insistent. She had loved him once, deeply, and part of her feared that love had never truly died. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, tempted to write, to explain, to offer something that might soften the impending storm. But she stopped herself. Some truths, she thought, had a way of breaking even the strongest hearts. Luca's phone buzzed again, pulling him from his pacing. Another message. He stared at it, hands trembling, not from fear, but from the impossible surge of emotion that surged through him. Pride screamed to ignore it, to discard it, to retreat into the fortress of his opulence where no one could penetrate. Yet something deeper, something primal, demanded he look. He unlocked the message, and there it was. A single sentence, deceptively simple, yet loaded with the weight of years lost. They are yours. His vision blurred, thoughts colliding in a cacophony of disbelief and rage. Mine. The word tasted bitter on his tongue, as if it were a lie whispered by a cruel god. He could feel the walls of his meticulously ordered life begin to tilt, threatening collapse. Memories he had long buried, the soft laughter, the fleeting warmth of a love he had abandoned, resurfaced with cruel insistence. He had ignored her, turned his back on the only person who had ever truly seen him, and now the consequences lay before him, undeniable and irreversible. Isabella's apartment was quiet, yet tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. She could almost hear Luca's heartbeat from miles away, as though her own nerves were attuned to his turmoil. She had warned herself not to intervene, not to stir the past, but a tiny, fragile hope had taken root in her chest. Perhaps he would reach out, perhaps he would recognize the life that had grown without him. And yet, deep down, she feared that pride, his pride, would always outweigh love, that his control would always blind him to the truth that mattered most. Back in the penthouse, Luca's reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows caught his attention. The man staring back at him was both familiar and foreign. Sharp jawline, black eyes burning with a fury he barely recognized, shoulders tense with a weight he had never borne. Pride had defined him, insulated him from weakness, yet now it seemed a fragile shell, cracking under the pressure of a revelation he could neither escape nor ignore. He thought of his fiancée, radiant and composed, oblivious to the truth that now threatened to unravel everything, every plan, every celebration, every carefully crafted moment of control suddenly felt hollow. His fingers hovered over the screen, poised to respond, to demand explanations, to seek out the source of this impossible claim. But doubt, insidious, consuming, crept in. What if this was a mistake? What if the photograph, the message, the very reality of the children was a cruel illusion? Pride told him to resist, to ignore, to protect his life from the chaos threatening to invade it. And yet, something deeper, unspoken and undeniable, whispered that ignoring it would be far worse than confronting the truth. Meanwhile, Isabella sank back into the couch cushions, eyes closed, as if by shutting out the world she could stave off the inevitable confrontation. She could feel the tension radiating from the message she had sent, a tether connecting her to Luca across miles and memories. Her heart ached for him, for herself, for the children who had unknowingly become the pivot on which their fates now turned. She had thought she was strong enough to protect them, to shield them from the storm, yet even as she tried to convince herself of this, fear gnawed at her resolve. Luca's thoughts spiraled, memories colliding with speculation, pride clashing with instinct. He recalled the nights of passion and tenderness he had allowed himself once, the whispers of love and promises he had abandoned in favor of empire and power. How had he been so blind? How had pride suffocated the very heart that had once saved him? Every heartbeat pounded with guilt, every breath tasted of betrayal, both to himself and to the life that had grown in his absence. He reached for the phone again, scrolling through the messages, searching for clarity, for confirmation, for some tangible proof that would either destroy or redeem him. The twins' innocent faces stared back, unyielding, uncompromising. He saw them, and he saw himself, not the powerful Mafia boss, not the unassailable figure of fear and control, but a man stripped bare by choices he could never undo. Isabella's perspective remained anchored in the quiet apartment, yet the tension between them stretched across the city like a taut wire. She thought of Luca pacing, of his dark eyes narrowing, of the storm she knew was gathering in his chest. She feared his anger, feared his pride, yet she also feared the indifference that might follow if he chose to walk away, as he had so many times before. Her hand brushed against the photograph, tracing the edges of the children's smiles as though she could somehow soften the blow of revelation. Luca's fury was quiet, controlled on the surface but searing within. He could hear the distant strains of music from the engagement party, the laughter of guests oblivious to the tidal wave approaching. Every sound was amplified, each note a reminder of the hollow perfection of his life, now tainted by an impossible truth. His mind raced with possibilities, each more devastating than the last. Pride told him to destroy the evidence, to silence the intrusion, to maintain his golden facade at all costs. Yet instinct, deeper and more primal, demanded that he confront it, that he acknowledge what could no longer be denied. He stormed into his study, slamming the door behind him with a force that rattled the glass. The city outside continued its indifferent hum, unaware of the unraveling of one of its most formidable figures. Luca pressed his palm against the cool mahogany desk, leaning over as if the surface could anchor him to reason. He thought of the children, of Isabella, of the love he had abandoned and the consequences he had ignored. The storm within him mirrored the rain beginning to fall outside, each droplet a reminder of the chaos now permeating his life. And then the phone buzzed again. Another message. He froze, knuckles white, heart hammering, fingers trembling. A simple phrase illuminated the screen. "They need you." Luca's breath caught, a strangled sound of disbelief and rising panic. His pride screamed at him to resist, to discard the intrusion, to remain untouchable. But his heart, the part of him he had denied for so long, understood the gravity of the moment. The life he had ignored, the love he had forsaken, was calling him across the chasm of time and mistakes. The golden empire he had built teetered on the edge of collapse, and Luca Moretti was about to make a choice that would redefine everything. Luca dropped the phone onto the desk, his eyes wide with a mixture of fury and dread. Outside, the storm intensified, rattling the windows as if nature itself sensed the upheaval within. And then, as he stared at the darkening skyline, another notification appeared. This one not from Isabella, but from someone he never expected. The message contained 3 words: "It's happening now." Rain hammered against the penthouse windows, like the relentless ticking of a clock Luca had long ignored. The city below gleamed wet and unfeeling, lights reflecting in puddles like shards of broken glass. He had tried to reclaim control, to ignore the messages that had shattered the veneer of his golden life, but denial was no longer an option. Every fiber of his being screamed at him, the fury of pride clashing violently with a growing, raw panic he could not suppress. The photograph, the twins, was no longer just a memory frozen on a screen. It had become a pulse, a living accusation, a mark of all that he had abandoned. He replayed the moment in his mind, Isabella's hand hovering over the send button, the quiet apartment where she had waited in trepidation, and then the inevitable click that changed everything. He had refused to act immediately, convinced his pride could withstand the storm, but now the consequences clawed at him, insidious and immediate. Meanwhile, across town, Isabella's apartment was a different kind of chaos. She paced in a tight circle, the phone now resting heavily in her hand, the image of the twins seared into her memory. She had hoped that Luca would hesitate, that he might weigh pride against the undeniable truth of his children, but the silence that had followed was deafening. Her heart raced with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Every minute that passed seemed to stretch into hours, each second a reminder that the delicate balance of their lives was tipping toward disaster. Luca's perspective was a storm of contradictions. He wanted to scream, to crush the phone underfoot, to destroy the evidence of a life he had ignored. But the thought of the children, of Isabella's cautious, hesitant involvement, pierced through the armor of rage. He was both enraged and terrified, the two emotions coiling inside him like serpents in a gilded cage. His mind, so accustomed to control, now fought a losing battle against uncertainty, against the raw pull of a truth he had long refused to face. Isabella felt it too, the tension, the inevitability of what was coming. She moved toward the window, watching the rain trace rivulets down the glass, thinking of Luca pacing in his penthouse, imagining the conflict tearing through him. She could not know the depths of his turmoil, but she could feel it, a shared pulse that bound them across the city. And yet, even as fear gnawed at her, a stubborn strand of hope remained, that he would come, that he would acknowledge what mattered more than pride, more than power, more than the empire he had built. Luca's phone buzzed again, tearing him from the vortex of thought and memory. Another message, brief, urgent, unavoidable. Meet me, now. The words burned across the screen like fire on silk, demanding attention, insisting on action. Pride screamed at him to ignore it, to remain untouchable, but something deeper, a raw, instinctive knowledge, compelled him to respond. Every step toward the door felt like a battle, a test of will against the chaos he had created by ignoring the first warnings. Across the city, Isabella prepared herself for confrontation. She had anticipated his fury, his anger, the flood of emotion that would inevitably follow, but she had not anticipated the way it would ripple through her own heart. Her palms were damp, her pulse erratic, as she waited for the phone to ring, for the inevitable call that would mark the beginning of the unraveling. She had tried to steel herself, to remain calm, but fear was a persistent predator, stalking her thoughts, gnawing at her resolve. Luca moved through the streets in his black sedan, the engine a steady hum beneath the patter of rain against the windshield. He gripped the wheel with white-knuckled intensity, eyes dark with a mixture of anger and dread. His mind raced with the consequences of ignoring the truth, each possibility more terrifying than the last. Pride had guided him for so long, shielding him from vulnerability, from mistakes, from emotional exposure. But now it felt like a chain, binding him to errors he could not undo. Meanwhile, Isabella's thoughts were a tangle of memory and anticipation. She recalled the soft touches, the fleeting promises, the moments where love had been tangible and near, only to have them abandoned by his pride. And now the stakes were higher. Not just their hearts, but the children's lives hung in the balance. She feared Luca's reaction, feared his anger, feared the possibility of rejection. But even more, she feared inaction, the possibility that he would choose his pride over the life he had unknowingly helped create. As Luca approached the designated meeting place, the familiar streets now slick and reflective beneath the storm, his mind replayed every detail of the photograph, every whispered memory of Isabella, every choice he had made and forsaken. He was aware of the weight of his presence, of the power he carried, but tonight that weight felt irrelevant, almost trivial. What mattered was truth, raw and undeniable, and he was unprepared for the magnitude of what awaited him. Inside the meeting room, Isabella waited, the children asleep in the next room, unaware of the storm gathering just beyond the walls. Her fingers traced the edge of the coffee table, tapping in restless rhythm as she imagined Luca's expression upon arrival. Would he be furious? Would he demand explanations? Would he turn away, unable to bear the collapse of his carefully curated world? Every scenario played in her mind like a dark symphony, each note a harbinger of the tension that had built relentlessly over years of separation and unspoken truths. Luca entered, the door closing behind him with a quiet authority that made the room itself shiver. Isabella looked up, her breath catching at the sight of him. He was as formidable as ever, yet something in his eyes betrayed the storm within, the conflict tearing at his carefully constructed pride. For a brief moment, words failed them both, and the silence stretched between them like a taut rope ready to snap. Then, in a voice low and dangerous, Luca spoke, words laced with fury, disbelief, and something unspoken, raw, and desperate. "Why didn't you tell me?" Isabella swallowed, the weight of years and choices pressing down on her. I didn't know how," she whispered, voice trembling with the effort of restraint. I thought it was safer this way." But Luca did not move closer, did not reach for her, did not offer the comfort she secretly craved. His pride, honed and hardened over decades, pushed him back, creating a chasm wider than any distance that had ever separated them. His mind raced with the implications, the betrayal, the lost years, the consequences of a life lived apart from the very truth he now faced. And then, without warning, a phone buzzed. Isabella's gaze flicked to it, her heart sinking as she saw the notification flashing. Emergency, hospital, twins, critical. Luca's eyes followed, widening in a flash of horror. The photograph, the messages, the confrontation, it had all been a prelude. Now the consequences were tangible, immediate, undeniable. Pride and fear collided violently within him, a maelstrom that left him frozen for a heartbeat too long. Isabella's lips parted to speak, to offer reassurance, but Luca's gaze had already fixed on his own phone. The words burned into the screen like a brand. They're in danger. Now. The golden empire, the pride, the carefully controlled world he had built, it was unraveling faster than he could comprehend, and the first tangible consequence of his refusal to act was already screaming for his attention. The rain had become a torrent, lashing against the streets, turning asphalt into rivers of silver. Luca's black sedan sliced through the downpour, tires skimming puddles, engine humming like a predator on the hunt. Every fiber of his being was taut, alert, every muscle coiled with anticipation, with dread. He gripped the wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white, but even the familiar comfort of control, the careful dominance of his life as a mafia boss, felt futile against the storm raging both outside and inside him. The notification on his phone replayed in his mind with relentless insistence. They're in danger. Now. His heart pounded not only with fear, but with shame. Pride, his lifelong companion, suddenly seemed a cruel adversary, binding him to indecision when action was the only currency that mattered. Every second he had ignored the messages, every choice he had made to protect his empire over his family, now loomed like a shadow larger than any he had ever known. Inside the hospital, Isabella clutched the edge of a stiff vinyl chair, rainwater dripping from her coat onto the cold linoleum floor. Her chest ached with fear, each shallow breath a struggle. She had called the emergency line as soon as the twins had taken a turn for the worse, her voice trembling as she explained their condition. Nurses had moved quickly, efficient and detached, and yet the sterile smell, the fluorescent glare, the rhythmic beeping of monitors was unbearable. The hospital smelled of bleach and anxiety, of urgency and despair. Every second stretched, elongated by the gravity of helplessness. Luca's perspective was a kaleidoscope of chaos. The streets blurred past him in a wash of light and shadow, his mind racing through every possible outcome. Had he misjudged the gravity of the situation? Could the children survive without him? Every thought collided with memories he had tried to bury. Isabella's soft hands, the warmth of a life he had forsaken, laughter and whispered promises, now ghostly echoes in the corridors of his mind. Pride screamed at him to remain composed, to focus, to control. But control was meaningless in the face of imminent danger to what he had ignored for so long. Isabella's thoughts mirrored the urgency. She had watched them sleep just hours ago, healthy and giggling, and now monitors screamed warnings she could barely comprehend. Her hands shook as she adjusted the blanket over one twin, then the other, murmuring soft reassurances she did not feel, trying to inject calm where panic threatened to take root. She had survived alone before. She had protected them before. But tonight, alone was not enough. She needed Luca, needed the father who had remained absent for so long, whose presence she had once begged for, whose pride had denied her the very life she had been building in secret. Luca pulled into the hospital entrance, tires screeching across wet pavement. Rain plastered his hair to his forehead, clothing clinging uncomfortably to his skin, and yet he barely noticed. Every sense was heightened. The antiseptic smell of the lobby, the fluorescent light casting harsh reflections on polished floors, the distant wails of other emergencies blending with the sirens outside. He moved like a force of nature, straight through the sliding doors, leaving behind the world of control and empire for a reality that was raw, immediate, and unforgiving. Inside, Isabella had been moved to a small waiting area outside the pediatric ICU, the twins' monitors audible from the corridor. Her voice was quiet, whispering apologies into the air, murmuring for calm that she could not summon herself. Nurses came and went with urgent efficiency, but she clung to the space where she could see, where she could hear, where she could feel connected to them. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside her chest, and every sound, the beep of monitors, the shuffle of footsteps, the whispered voices, was amplified by fear. Luca burst into the waiting area, commanding attention with a presence that was almost violent in its intensity. Isabella turned, startled, her heart leaping at the sight of him. He was soaked, disheveled, yet somehow impossibly imposing. His black eyes, dark and fathomless, met hers, and for a moment words failed both of them. She had waited for him, hoped for him, and now he was here. but presence alone could not undo the magnitude of what had occurred. "They're critical," Isabella whispered, voice trembling. I don't know if—" Luca moved closer, cutting through the sterile tension like a shadow across the floor. "Where are they?" His voice was low, dangerous, desperate, a tonal clash of authority and raw panic. Pride and power still clung to him like second skin, but they were compromised, fractured by fear. "Tell me everything." Isabella's fingers brushed his arm, a fleeting contact that belied her relief and terror simultaneously. They were fine until an hour ago. Something, I don't know what, fever, then weakness. They barely responded. The doctors said it's critical. Her voice faltered, and Luca felt the weight of it, the burden of years lost, of absence, of choices that had led to this precipice. Luca's mind raced, snapping between pride, rage, and a growing, unavoidable dread. Each heartbeat was an echo of mistakes, each breath a reminder of his absence, each second a countdown to a reality he had ignored for far too long. He could feel it, the world cracking beneath him, the golden life he had built now irrelevant, insignificant, compared to the fragile lives in the next room. His fists clenched at his sides, teeth grinding. He had built empires, toppled rivals, commanded fear, and yet here he was, powerless, a man stripped bare by love and absence, facing consequences he could not dictate or control. Isabella felt it too. She watched him, the storm reflected in his dark eyes, a mirror of the turbulence in her own chest. She wanted to speak, to reach out, to beg him to act, but words felt futile. Actions alone mattered now. The storm had arrived in full force. Chaos, danger, fear. And the only thing that could temper it was the man who had abandoned them, the father who now faced a reckoning. A nurse appeared at the corridor entrance, clipboard in hand, eyes wary. "You're Luca Moretti?" she asked. He nodded, voice clipped, tone taut with urgency. "They're in room 3. We need you to follow protocol, but you must stay calm." Calm. The word struck Luca as absurd, almost mocking. Calm was a luxury he could no longer afford, a concept irrelevant against the torrent of emotion, fear and regret surging through him. He strode forward, rain-soaked coat flapping like dark wings, Isabella trailing close, heart pounding with anticipation and terror. The twins lay on adjacent beds, small and vulnerable beneath crisp white sheets, monitors beeping a frantic rhythm. Luca's breath caught, chest constricting at the sight of them, their tiny limbs twitching slightly under medical intervention. His hand hovered over them, unsure, hesitant yet desperate to touch, to reclaim what he had ignored for years. Pride had no place here. Authority had no place here. Only raw human instinct, only desperate, aching need could guide him now. Isabella's hands rested on the blankets, her fingertips tracing the curves of their cheeks. Tears pricked her eyes, a torrent suppressed only by the need for clarity, for guidance, for action. She looked to Luca, hoping, silently pleading, for the man who had abandoned them to find the part of himself capable of saving them. The monitors beeped in a rhythm too fast, too insistent. The storm outside mirrored the storm within, each lightning flash illuminating the sterile room in stark bursts of white. Luca's chest tightened, panic threatening to fracture the composed exterior he had spent decades cultivating. The golden life, the empire, the pride. It all meant nothing in the face of what lay before him. Tiny lives teetering on the edge, dependent on a man who had forsaken them for so long. And then, a doctor's voice cut through the tension, urgent, clipped. "We need you both to step back. This is critical. We can't—" Luca froze, every muscle taut, a predator suddenly aware that his prey might slip beyond reach. Isabella's hand brushed his arm, grounding him, yet even that small connection could not mitigate the dread that had seeped into every corner of his being. The storm, both outside and inside, had reached its apex. Decisions had to be made, lives hung in balance, and the moment of action, delicate, irrevocable, unavoidable, had arrived. The monitors flared red, alarms screaming with urgency. Luca's breath caught as he realized the impossible. The twins' vitals were plummeting faster than anyone could react. He looked to Isabella, then at the small forms in the beds, and whispered in a voice barely audible over the chaos, "I won't lose them. Not again." And yet, outside the room, the storm raged on, indifferent, relentless, as if mocking the fragility of human control. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and tension, the sharp tang of fear hanging heavy in the air. Luca Moretti stood rigid, chest tight, jaw clenched, staring at the monitors that tracked the fragile rhythms of the twins' lives. Each beep was a hammer pounding against his carefully constructed pride, each flicker of the red lights a reminder that control was an illusion. He had conquered cities, crushed rivals, and commanded fear like currency, but here he was powerless. Here pride was meaningless. Isabella watched him, heart caught between relief and terror. His dark eyes, usually impenetrable, now flickered with raw emotion, panic, guilt, desperation, but also a stubborn refusal to surrender entirely. She had expected anger, she had expected fury, but this was different. He was conflicted, torn between instinct and a lifetime of self-imposed dominance. The storm outside mirrored the storm within him, rain lashing against the windows like a relentless metronome, counting down the fragile lives inside. Luca's fingers hovered over the phone again. Messages continued to pour in, reports from doctors, updates from staff, pleas from Isabella, and alerts from his empire that demanded attention even in this critical moment. Pride whispered, sharper than the alarms, "Ignore it. You can't save them. Focus on yourself, your empire. Don't let your control slip." Every instinct that had built his empire now screamed at him to resist, to shield himself from chaos, to deny vulnerability. Isabella's perspective was taut with desperation. She had expected him to act, to lean on the instinct she had always trusted would exist beneath his pride. And yet, he hesitated. Each second of indecision felt like a betrayal, each moment of stillness a widening chasm between them. She had tried to prepare herself for his anger, but she had not anticipated this, his refusal, subtle but absolute, to fully confront what mattered most. Doctors hovered, their clipped voices urgent, offering instructions that Luca ignored, brushing past him as if his presence were irrelevant. He was not deaf to the orders, not blind to the urgency, but pride, a force he had never allowed to be compromised, demanded a measure of detachment. Acting too rashly, showing too much emotion, surrendering completely, these were weaknesses he could not permit even now. The twins' monitors beeped faster, alarms flaring in a crescendo that pierced Luca's chest like a blade. Isabella's hands trembled as she reached for the children, murmuring reassurances that barely masked her fear. She looked to Luca, searching for guidance, for action, for acknowledgement of the gravity that neither of them could escape. But he remained poised at the edge, calculating, silent, a storm held in check by a fragile dam of pride. He recalled the photograph that had set everything in motion, the simple image of the twins, innocent and unaware of the chaos their existence had wrought. Pride had led him to dismiss the initial shock, to pretend it was an intrusion he could control. And now, with their lives teetering, that same pride whispered again, "You cannot save them. You cannot fix what you have ignored. Remain untouchable." Isabella's breaths came faster, shallow and urgent, her gaze flicking between the monitors, the twins, and Luca. She whispered their names, soft pleas, urging them to hold on, to fight. She tried to anchor herself, tried to focus on the fragility and resilience of life, but fear gnawed at her from all sides. And as much as she needed Luca, she realized that she could not force him to abandon the armor of pride he had worn for decades. Luca's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening as he surveyed the room. Authority had always been his weapon, his shield, but here, in the sterile glare of the hospital, authority could do nothing. His mind raced, replaying every choice he had made. The abandonment, the empire he had chosen over love, the years spent in isolation, believing control equaled power. Every step had led to this moment, and yet action remained optional, a test of will against instinct and ego. Outside the room, the storm's rhythm intensified, rain beating against the glass in sharp staccato. The twins' heartbeats on the monitors became almost synchronized with the storm, each rapid pulse echoing the fear that gripped everyone in the room. Luca's hands trembled slightly, but he did not reach for them. Not yet. Pride demanded restraint, control, the illusion that chaos could be mastered. His chest heaved as though the storm itself were pressing down, yet he maintained an outward calm, a calculated stillness that betrayed nothing, except to those who truly saw him. Isabella's hands clenched the blankets, her nails pressing into fabric as if she could transmit urgency and strength to the fragile bodies beneath her. She wanted to scream, to demand action, to force him to act, but she understood in that moment that Luca's battle was not with circumstance, it was with himself. And while the children's lives hung by a thread, his pride had become an invisible barrier between instinct and intervention. Luca's phone buzzed again, a final warning, a plea from the medical staff. Immediate action required. Failure to intervene may result in irreversible consequences. He stared at it, chest tightening, his mind a battlefield. Pride urged him to destroy the device, to silence the alarms, to maintain control over the chaos. Heart urged him to move, to act, to save. The conflict was visceral, tearing at his very identity. He exhaled slowly, trying to suppress the inner tumult, trying to contain the raw emotion that threatened to crack the steel of his persona. Pride had always been his ally, his armor, his defining feature, and yet here it threatened to destroy what mattered most. He glanced at Isabella, at the children, and for a fleeting moment doubt flickered in his eyes. Could he abandon pride, even when the stakes were life itself? Isabella's gaze locked on him, a silent plea, a desperate hope that he would act. The storm outside mirrored the tension inside, the room itself holding its breath. Seconds stretched into eternity, each moment a knife twisting in the fragile fabric of hope. And then Luca moved, not toward action but away, toward detachment, toward the safety of controlled distance. I need a moment, he muttered, almost to himself, fingers brushing the edge of the table, not touching the twins. His chest heaved with a storm he refused to release, eyes flicking to the phone, then away. Pride, that cruel and unwavering companion, had claimed victory once more. Action was deferred, intervention delayed. Lives, fragile, dependent, innocent, hung in the balance. Isabella's hands froze mid-motion, the weight of his refusal crashing down on her. She understood now that Luca's choice was deliberate, calculated, even if unspoken. Pride had not simply guided him, pride had imprisoned him. And while the world outside raged with rain and wind, the real storm was inside the room, within him, and within the fragile thread of life that bound them all together. The monitors screamed, each beep sharper, faster, a pulse of warning that could not be ignored. Nurses circled, their movements urgent, but Luca remained rigid, a figure of silent conflict. The storm in his chest had reached its apex, and yet he refused to surrender, refused to abandon the barrier of pride that had defined him. A sudden, piercing alarm erupted from the monitors. The twins' heart rates plummeted, dangerously low, red warning lights flashing in urgent rhythm. Luca's fingers twitched involuntarily, inches from the children, yet he did not move. Isabella's voice broke, a whisper trembling with panic. "Luca, now." He froze, pride and fear colliding in the same instant as the room erupted in chaos. And in that moment, the fragile barrier of control cracked irreparably, just as one of the twins took a sudden, imperceptible turn toward collapse. The alarms shrieked like banshees in the sterile hospital corridor, echoing off walls that smelled of antiseptic and fear. Luca Moretti's chest heaved, breaths jagged, fingers twitching over the small, fragile bodies of the twins. Yet pride, that relentless tyrant, held him back. Every instinct screamed to act, to save, to lean into the raw, unvarnished need of the moment. But he remained frozen, a figure carved from control, defiant even as the world unraveled around him. Isabella's eyes were wide, glimmering with unshed tears. She gripped the edge of the hospital bed as though her strength could transfer into the tiny bodies beneath her hands. One twin's chest rose and fell with an almost imperceptible rhythm. The other was weaker, pale, limbs trembling. Her heart hammered as she whispered prayers she didn't believe, begging for intervention, praying Luca would finally set aside the pride that had already cost too much. The storm outside intensified, rain pelting the hospital windows, wind rattling the glass in urgent percussion. It was as if the city itself were responding to the crisis within, a mirror to the chaos inside Luca's chest. The empire he had built, the life he had controlled, was meaningless here. Power was irrelevant, influence a hollow joke. Pride was a cage, locking him in place as the children's lives hung by the thinnest of threads. Luca's fingers hovered, trembling, just above the edge of one tiny hand. He wanted to reach, to touch, to anchor himself and them in reality, but something, ego, pride, fear, held him back. Memories assaulted him, Isabella's laughter, the warmth of her hand in his, moments when he had felt alive, human, unguarded. All of it had been sacrificed at the altar of control, and now the cost was absolute. The children, innocent and unaware, were paying for his absence. Isabella leaned over, brushing damp hair from the twins' foreheads, whispering their names, murmuring fragments of comfort. Her own fear was a living thing, clawing at her, gnawing at resolve. She dared not hope, dared not believe that Luca's presence alone could save them. She knew the final measure would be action, yet action remained suspended above them, blocked by the invisible barrier of his pride. The monitors flared again, red lights blinking in frenzied staccato. A nurse called out, voice clipped, efficient. "Immediate intervention required. Stabilize now." Chaos erupted in motion around Luca, but he could not move, caught in a paralysis of emotion. Pride warred with instinct, with love, with guilt, leaving him stranded in the unbearable center of a storm he had once thought he could command. Outside, the wind screamed, rain lashing at the hospital like the relentless drum of fate. Luca's breath fogged in the sterile air, eyes darting between the monitors and the small, fragile bodies. His mind spun with every possibility. What if he was too late? What if pride had condemned them before he even touched them? Every heartbeat was an accusation, a reminder that years of absence, years of rejection had led them here. Isabella's perspective shifted to memory, to the years she had protected them alone. Every scraped knee, every sleepless night, every whispered story had been her doing. Yet now, faced with the crisis that Luca had indirectly caused through absence, her fear was different, urgent, raw, consuming. She needed him to act, needed the father who had turned away to show instinct, courage, and humanity. She needed him to break the chains of pride before the fragile thread of life snapped. Luca finally moved, a fraction, a twitch. It was not decisive, not heroic, just a trembling acknowledgement of the reality before him. His fingers brushed the edge of a blanket, then hovered again, frozen by internal conflict. Pride still whispered, "Do not interfere. Maintain control. Remain untouchable." But instinct roared louder. "They need you now." The children's vitals dipped further, the monitors flashing alarmingly fast. One twin's small chest rose and fell with increasing difficulty, while the other teetered on the edge of collapse. Isabella's hands trembled as she attempted to stabilize them herself, calling out to nurses who moved like automatons in a precise, detached rhythm. Luca's eyes darkened, heart pounding, chest tight, and yet he hesitated. Every muscle screamed to act, but the invisible chains of pride constricted tighter with each passing second. A doctor appeared at the bedside, urgency etched into every line of her face. "We need immediate intervention. Now both hands on the procedure." Luca froze, gaze locking on the tiny, vulnerable forms beneath his hands. Time slowed, stretched, elongating every heartbeat into an unbearable eternity. He could see the life force within them flickering, like candle flames battling wind. He could hear Isabella's quiet prayers, her whispered encouragements, the subtle tremor of fear she tried to hide. And in that instant, the weight of years lost pressed upon him, the full magnitude of absence, pride, and selfishness crashing into raw necessity. His hands twitched again, almost moving toward them, but still restrained, still locked by fear and ego. The room seemed to constrict around him, every sound amplified, the beeping monitors, the clicking heels of nurses, the hiss of oxygen, the thundering of rain outside. The storm, the crisis, the raw fragility of life pressed in from all sides. Pride, for decades a shield, was now a cage. Isabella's voice broke through, trembling yet commanding. "Luca, now, don't wait. Please, just help them." Her words cut through him, sharp as glass, slicing pride in two. Yet even in that moment he hesitated, the invisible chains of control too deeply embedded to be broken by urgency alone. He wanted to act, needed to act, and yet ego clung to him, whispering of consequences, appearances, dominance. He was caught between the man he had built himself to be and the father he had ignored becoming one, too late. The monitors flared violently, red lights screaming, alarms shrieking, a cacophony that mirrored the storm outside. Luca's vision blurred with the intensity of emotion. Guilt, fear, despair, and something raw and unshakable. Love. He could no longer resist, could no longer cling to pride when the lives of two innocents hung in the balance. The storm inside him finally broke, and with a shuddering breath, he acted. He moved, decisive now, but the cost of hesitation lingered. Nurses and doctors coordinated rapidly, hands efficient, movements precise. Luca's own hands, now shaking with raw adrenaline, assisted where possible. The room became a flurry of controlled chaos, each second a battle, each movement a plea for survival. Isabella watched him, a mixture of hope and disbelief flooding her. For the first time, pride had been set aside in favor of action, but the consequences of delay were impossible to ignore. Outside, the rain pounded harder, lightning flashing across the city like the universe itself, bearing witness to the descent of lives into chaos. Inside, the twins' small forms struggled, fragile as reeds in wind, fighting for every heartbeat. Luca's chest heaved, adrenaline and guilt intertwining, his presence finally a force for life rather than absence. Then, in a sudden, sharp spike, the monitors flatlined. Silence erupted, oppressive, suffocating. Isabella gasped, tears streaming freely. Luca's fingers froze above the tiny chest, heart hammering, mind spinning in horror. Pride, fear, and love collided violently. He had acted, but was it too late? A nurse's voice screamed over the flat line, "We need a code, now!" And in that moment, Luca realized the descent was far from over, and the lives he had just begun to fight for hung by a thread thinner than he could bear to see. The sterile hospital lights burned overhead, casting harsh reflections on the polished floor as Luca Moretti's heart hammered in his chest. He stood frozen at the edge of the pediatric intensive care unit, eyes locked on the monitors that had just flatlined, the alarm screaming like the collapse of the universe itself. Sweat plastered his hair to his forehead, clothes clinging to his body, chest heaving as panic, guilt, and raw desperation tore through him. He had acted, finally, but the consequences of pride delayed were immediate and undeniable. Isabella's hands shook as she gripped the edge of the bed, her fingers trembling with every rapid beat of her own terrified heart. She had watched him hesitate, had watched the man she once loved let ego hold him back while the tiny lives he had ignored for so long dangled on the edge of oblivion. Now, in this moment of pure crisis, she felt a grim awareness. Delay had consequences that no skill, no wealth, no influence could reverse. Luca's mind raced, replaying every choice he had made, every step that had led to this room. Pride had been his armor, his weapon, the shield that protected him from vulnerability. And yet here, it had betrayed him. A cruel companion whose loyalty had expired the instant innocence was at stake. Every memory of Isabella, of love, of the fleeting warmth of connection he had abandoned, crashed into him with the force of a tidal wave. He saw not just the children's fragile forms, but the years lost, the moments he could never reclaim, the life he had ignored while building empires of fear. Outside the ICU, rain lashed against the hospital windows, the storm relentless, indifferent, mirroring the chaos inside. Every flash of lightning illuminated the room in stark relief. Monitors blinking red, nurses moving in coordinated urgency, Isabella's face pale and strained with fear. Luca's gaze darted between her and the monitors, his chest tightening as realization spread through him like fire. The photograph, the messages, the years of absence, all had led to this apex, this undeniable truth. Pride had almost cost them everything. Isabella's thoughts mirrored the intensity of the moment. She had feared this revelation for years, the awakening of consequences that could not be reversed. Every heartbeat of the twins was a drumbeat of warning, a pulse that demanded acknowledgement of the truth she had tried to carry alone. And now, seeing Luca's hesitation, the flicker of horror and guilt crossing his face, she knew that he had finally grasped what she had known all along. His choices had irrevocably shaped their lives. The flat line blared again. Luca's breath caught in his throat, chest constricting with panic. He dropped to his knees beside the bed, hands hovering over the twins, trembling. Pride had no place here. Authority was meaningless. Only action mattered now, raw, urgent, immediate. He applied CPR, following instructions shouted by doctors, his mind and body moving with desperate precision. Every compression was a battle, every breath a plea for forgiveness for years lost. And then a second monitor began to beep, a fragile rhythm returning. One twin's vitals stabilized slightly, then the other. Isabella exhaled a shuddering breath, tears streaking her face. Relief was tentative, fragile, yet it illuminated the stark reality. Action had saved them, but the delay had been critical. Pride had nearly destroyed what love alone could have preserved. Luca's hands rested briefly on the edge of the beds, chest heaving, face pale. The revelation hit him with sudden, paralyzing clarity. His ego, his pride, the empire he had built, the carefully constructed image of control, all of it was meaningless against life itself. The empire had no value here. Authority and fear could not reclaim innocence, could not undo absence, could not replace the years lost. He realized with devastating clarity that the consequences of emotional denial could not be contained within himself. They had real, tangible victims. Isabella reached out, placing a tentative hand on his arm. "Do you understand now?" she whispered, voice trembling but steady. Luca's dark eyes met hers, and in them she saw not only horror and guilt, but also an unfiltered, raw comprehension. The full weight of the mistakes he had made, the lives he had nearly sacrificed for the sake of pride. He nodded, barely, words failing him in the face of the enormity. I see it, he murmured, voice hoarse. I've been blind for too long. Pride had crumbled, leaving him raw, exposed, human. The revelation was not a gentle awakening. It was an avalanche, crashing down on him, burying him in regret, in recognition of everything lost. Outside, the storm persisted, relentless, indifferent. Each clap of thunder seemed to underscore the severity of the consequences he had ignored. The rain poured against the windows, blurring the city into streaks of silver, a reflection of the chaos, the vulnerability, and the fragility of life he had dismissed for decades. Luca felt the weight of every moment of absence pressing down upon him, every laugh he had missed, every milestone gone unnoticed. Isabella's gaze moved. Between him and the twins, understanding the depth of his realization. Yet awareness alone was insufficient. Knowledge without action could not undo the danger, could not heal the wounds inflicted by delay. She understood that the next steps were critical. Every decision now mattered, every moment a choice between salvation and devastation. Luca's mind spiraled as the full truth settled over him. He had been a man of control, a master of fear, a sovereign of influence, but all that power had no meaning against the vulnerability of those he loved. His pride, once a shield, had been a barrier, and the consequences were now undeniable. He saw clearly the lives that had almost been lost, the years that could not be recovered, and the irreversible mark of his absence. The revelation cut deeper than any physical threat, more sharply than any betrayal from a rival. It was the brutal truth that he had been blind, that love had always required surrender, and that refusal had consequences far greater than inconvenience or embarrassment. It had nearly cost lives. Each beat of the twins' hearts was a reminder that the clock was unforgiving, and every delay had real, tangible repercussions. And then a nurse stepped forward, her voice clipped, efficient. We've stabilized them for now, but their condition remains critical. Any delay in treatment could be fatal. Luca froze, chest tightening. Awareness alone was insufficient. He had seen the truth. Now he had to act. Pride had been stripped from him, replaced by urgency, desperation, and the stark necessity of action. Luca's gaze shifted to the window, to the storm still raging outside. Then his phone vibrated, another message, not from Isabella, not from a doctor, but from someone he had never expected. There's more you don't know. Come quickly. Now. The revelation of near tragedy had been only the beginning. Something even larger, more devastating demanded his immediate attention. And as Luca stared at the screen, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down with suffocating inevitability. The rain had not relented. It lashed the streets like a relentless drumbeat, relentless, indifferent, as if the universe itself were marking every second of delay. Luca Moretti's black sedan skidded across slick asphalt, tires slicing through puddles that mirrored the storm within his chest. Every heartbeat reverberated through him like a warning bell. Pride had been stripped away. Awareness alone was insufficient. The stakes were life itself. He had been warned, reminded, threatened by consequence, and he was now racing against time to undo what his own ego had nearly destroyed. Inside the hospital, Isabella remained at the twins' side, frail and tense, eyes never leaving the monitors, fingers brushing their tiny hands as if the contact alone could lend strength. Every breath she drew was measured, every movement careful. She had seen Luca's hesitation, had endured it, had watched the man she loved wrestle with a pride that had nearly condemned them all. And now, as alarms began to quiet with the twins' stabilized vitals, a new sense of dread crept over her. The emergency message Luca had just received, the one she hadn't seen, promised more peril beyond the hospital walls. Luca's mind was a whirlwind, a storm that mirrored the rain pelting the city outside. The message from an unknown source burned across the screen. "There's more you don't know. Come quickly, now." He had no time to decipher subtleties or calculate risk. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His pride had been only the first misstep. A larger consequence loomed, one he could neither ignore nor manipulate. He gripped the wheel, knuckles white, mind scanning every possibility, every threat, every angle. Failure was no longer an option. Meanwhile, Isabella paced the corridor outside the ICU, gripping her coat as though it could shield her from anticipation. Every second felt like a minute stretched into infinity. The sterile hospital walls closing in, the fluorescent lights glaring like accusatory eyes. She had feared Luca's absence before, his pride, his hesitation, but now the stakes were external, immediate. Something, or someone, was demanding intervention beyond the fragile bubble of life in the ICU. She felt it in her bones. This was only the beginning of a reckoning that would extend far beyond the twins' fragile bodies. Luca arrived at the address sent in the cryptic message, a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Rain poured in sheets, soaking him through to the skin, plastering his coat to his frame. He stepped out of the car, chest heaving, heart thrumming like a war drum. Every sense was on edge. The smell of wet concrete, the metallic tang of rain mixing with the faint scent of oil, the sound of distant sirens echoing against the walls of the city. He moved with lethal precision, awareness honed by decades of control and dominance, but tempered now by urgency and raw emotion, untempered by pride. Inside the warehouse, shadows clung to every corner, thick and oppressive. A single light swung from the ceiling, casting a narrow spotlight on crates stacked haphazardly. The sound of dripping water echoed in the cavernous space, mixing with a low, almost imperceptible groan. Luca's steps were silent, calculated, yet each heartbeat thundered in his ears. He reached the center, and there she was, Isabella. Not alone, but restrained, her eyes wide, glistening with fear. Behind her, a figure he did not recognize, a presence that radiated control and threat. Luca Moretti. The figure's voice was smooth, almost cordial, yet the steel beneath it promised violence. "You've ignored consequences long enough. Now, the final reckoning arrives." Isabella's gaze flicked to Luca, relief and terror intertwined. He's coming for us," she whispered. "I didn't know how to stop it." Luca's chest tightened. The twins were still in the hospital, fragile, vulnerable. Every second spent here was another gamble, another risk imposed by his prior pride. Yet he could not abandon Isabella. Not again. Not when the consequences of absence had already been too high. He stepped forward, voice low and commanding. "Let her go. Whatever this is, it ends now." The figure smiled faintly, almost mockingly. "It ends when you surrender everything, Luca. Pride, control, empire, or they all pay." And in that moment, a door at the back of the warehouse creaked open. Luca's instinct screamed. He rushed forward, every movement precise, every muscle coiled. The figure reacted with alarming speed, and a struggle erupted, violent and chaotic. Shadows became fluid, a blur of motion, fists and feet colliding with force. Luca's mind was singularly focused. Protect Isabella, survive, act decisively. Every calculated tactic he had learned as a Mafia boss now fused with raw instinct, desperation sharpening reflexes he had honed for decades. Parallel to this, Isabella's perspective was a storm of fear and adrenaline. She twisted, trying to free herself, but her bonds were tight. Her eyes darted to Luca, noting his every movement, the intensity of his presence, the ferocity of his protective instinct. Relief mingled with fear, relief that he was here, capable, unstoppable, fear that the danger was greater than either of them could yet comprehend. Luca finally overpowered the figure, forcing him to the ground. Rainwater from the warehouse roof dripped onto the concrete, mingling with sweat, blood, and fear. The man struggled, coughing, snarling, but Luca's grip was absolute. Authority, experience, raw force, all converged in this moment. Yet even as he subdued the threat, the realization hit him. Pride had cost them too much already. Any hesitation here would be too late. And then he saw it. Across the warehouse in the shadows, partially hidden beneath a tarp. A box. The twins. His pulse stuttered, chest tightening as understanding struck. The person behind the threat had exploited his delay, his pride, to escalate the danger. The image of the twins, once innocent and safe, now placed directly in harm's way, drove a spike of fury through him. He rushed to the tarp, lifting it to reveal not the twins themselves, but their belongings. Small shoes, blankets, tiny toys, each item soaked in rainwater, abandoned. Panic surged again. Were they still in danger? Was the hospital compromised? His mind raced, heart pounding with an adrenaline he had not felt in years. Pride had blinded him to vulnerability. Now, raw instinct guided every step. Isabella rushed to his side. "They're safe," she gasped, her hands trembling as she pointed to the small monitors she had managed to carry with her from the hospital. Portable monitors showing the twins' vitals, stable but still critical. The doctors, they're still alive, just barely. Luca's knees buckled slightly, chest heaving as relief, terror and disbelief collided in his mind. The revelation was profound. The consequences of his pride had been nearly fatal, yet action, finally decisive, desperate, had preserved life. And yet the reckoning was not over. Outside the warehouse, sirens wailed and the storm continued to rage. The world beyond this confrontation had not paused, and the empire he had built remained a backdrop to the fragile truth he had only just learned to honor. Love and action outweigh control and pride. As Luca and Isabella embraced briefly, rain dripping from their hair, a second message appeared on Luca's phone. The text was chilling, simple, undeniable. "It's not over. You've won a battle, but the war has just begun." Luca froze, eyes narrowing, chest tightening, the weight of unresolved consequence pressing down on him. He had survived the immediate reckoning, protected those he loved, but the true aftermath, the hidden web of danger, betrayal, and the cost of pride, loomed larger than ever. Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent, relentless, and in that moment he realized the price of pride would haunt him forever.